Hello everyone, my name is Anthony Housefather and I'm a member of the Canadian Parliament. It has never been more important that elected officials from across the world speak out against attempts to delegitimize the State of Israel, particularly as these attempts are increasingly brought into the mainstream by organizations, including the UN Human Rights Council. The characterization of Israel as an apartheid state is both wrong and offensive. It is also a particularly dangerous label. This pernicious campaign undermines the very nature of the country by arguing that Israel is inherently criminal and therefore illegitimate. It is critical that we expose this libel for what it is, legally, historically, and factually baseless. First of all, the indigenous relationship of the Jewish people to the Israeli territory must not be discounted, particularly as those who seek to delegitimize Israel continuously deride it as a settler colonial project. There has been a persistent Jewish presence in the land of Israel for 3,500 years, and the Jews' return to Israel is just that, a return, not an attempt at colonization. The use of white settler colonial terminology in relation to Israel and to Zionism inaccurately ties the national aspirations of an indigenous group within its historical territory to the historical colonial projects of European countries. There is no such link. The allegation that Israel is guilty of apartheid also ignores the reality on the ground. Arab citizens of Israel enjoy rights equal to Jewish Israelis. Arab citizens of Israel make up a large percentage of the country's pharmacists, doctors, and entrepreneurs. Arabs serve in parliament, the judiciary, and the consular corps. While there is certainly evidence that Arab communities in Israel deserve greater support from the state, there is no apartheid in Israel. In addition to being offensive to Israel and supporters of Israel across the world, this characterization diminishes the horrific experience of those who suffered under apartheid in South Africa. Using the term apartheid as a tool to attack and delegitimize Israel, by the way, the only truly democratic state in the Middle East, disrespects the struggle of South Africans against apartheid. By denying these fundamental facts, influential organizations like Amnesty International and the UN Human Rights Council have used their legitimacy and reputations to market their false advertising to people of goodwill all over the world who stand against crimes against humanity and human rights abuses. We are seeing, and the summer of 2021 is a good example of this, how the anti-Israel campaign of those organizations has been adopted by well-meaning people the world over. The results are downright dangerous. Just recently, in May of last year, during the Israel-Hamas conflict, we saw many anti-Israel protests across Canada. I will reiterate, I will always protect the right of all Canadians to express their opinions peacefully and lawfully. However, these protests frequently turn violent. Some of the protesters openly expressed their support for Hamas, a terrorist entity whose mission statement is to destroy the State of Israel. There were stones thrown at Jews outside the Israeli consulate in Montreal, and visibly Jewish individuals were attacked and berated, with the anti-Israel rhetoric devolving into anti-Semitism. B'nai B'rith recorded a 54% increase in violent incidents in May 2021 over the same period in 2020. Indeed, during this period, anti-Semitic activists drove through my own district and threatened to harm Jews. For the first time as an elected official, I had Jewish constituents who were afraid to send their children to the park and asked if they should take off their kippahs or remove their mezuzahs from their doors. I never thought I would see this happen in Canada. Holding Jewish Canadians responsible for the actions of Israel is the height of anti-Semitism and a consequence of the inflammatory language used by the anti-Israel community. This is just one example of how the false characterization of Israel as an apartheid state has real and very dangerous consequences. It also demonstrates how all too often legitimate criticism of the Israeli government is undermined by anti-Semites who claim to be anti-Israel to mask their anti-Semitism. When any organization or individual singles out Israel and neglects to treat Israel as an equal member of the family of nations, they expose themselves for what they are, anti-Semitic. To have Israel as the sole permanent agenda item at the UNHCR is a clear example of this disproportionate focus on the world's only Jewish majority state. Anti-Semitism is the oldest form of hatred, and it continues to spread in new forms and under new disguises. I commit to continuing to work across party lines with legislators from around the world, continue to fight both anti-Semitism and unfair attacks against the state of Israel.